Yeah, so thanks, Angela, and thanks everyone for coming today to hear me talk about everyone's favorite lunch hour topic, urban rat problems. So like Angela said, I'm currently an epidemiologist on the Environmental Health Services team at the BC CDC. But the work I'll be talking about today, I did as a part of my PhD in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC. And importantly, this work was funded by the city of Vancouver, specifically in search of rat protocols for managing the rat problem in their city specifically. And I did this work with a group called the Vancouver Rat Project and the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. So this video that you can see playing here on the right, this is just a video of some rats enjoying their time in Vancouver's downtown east side. And this is actually a community garden where some of you may have gotten your lunch food today. And I thought I would just start this presentation with a quick poll question to get everyone thinking about why urban rat problems are important. So the question is, where are rats not a major issue? And I'll just give everyone 30 to 40 seconds to give their thoughts here. Okay, so that looks like we've got most people answering that. So I will click out of that here and show the correct answer. So the answer was Antarctica and Alberta. And you can see that about 20% of you got that, while the majority of you clicked on E. There are no areas where rats are not a major issue. So it depends on how you define a major issue, and we'll get into that throughout this talk. But you can compare your answers to this global distribution map of rats that I've shown here on the next slide. So this shows the distribution of the two main species of urban rats, the black rat or Rattus rattus, and the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. So everywhere in red is where these rats thrive around the world. And as you can see, there are only a couple places where they aren't thriving, and that includes Alberta, that strange hole there in the middle of the map, and Antarctica. And we can go back and talk about Alberta, how they're a unique case at the end of this presentation. But I usually like to start by showing this map to start answering the question of why municipal rat problems? You know, in the context of all of the big important issues that the world faces today, things like climate change, famine, the war in Ukraine, why are municipal rat problems a problem worth talking about in a setting like this? So as you can see, you can go to pretty much any major metropolitan area in the world, and you can expect them to be dealing with their own significant rat problems. So it is a global problem. And within those cities, rats are problematic for a number of different reasons. And one of the most important reasons is that they are able to carry a number of zoonotic pathogens that can spread from rats into the human population. And I think when most people think about rats and disease, their mind jumps to a disease called the plague or the Black Death. This is a disease that's caused by a bacteria, Yersinia pestis. And although it causes hundreds to thousands of cases around the world today, it was most famously associated with the deaths of about a quarter of the European population in the 14th century. But what some people might not know is that today rats are able to carry many different zoonotic pathogens. And in Vancouver alone, the Vancouver Rat Project has been working to describe the ecology of the rat populations in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and to study how that ecology interacts with the epidemiology of the different pathogens that rats carry in this neighborhood. And so here you can see a picture of myself and another PhD student at the time, Kaylee Byers, sampling rats that we caught in this neighborhood. And in the front of our laboratory van that we bought off Craigslist and converted into the montage of duct tape and things from IKEA that you see here, I've sampled this rat's blood, and we found that rats are able to carry bacteria in the genus Bartonella, and certain species of this bacteria cause a disease called cat scratch disease in people. In the back, you can see Kaylee doing some of the glory work of rat detective work, and she was actually sampling the urine from the rat that you see in the cage there. So what we did is we caught these rats in those live cages, and then we put them in the back of the van over those little trays and waited till they urinated into them, and then we'd suck it up with a syringe and later test it. And we found that these rats were able to carry a bacteria called Leptospira interrogans, which they could shed in their urine and spread it to not only other rats, but other animals and sometimes people. And in this single neighborhood, we found that these rats were able to carry many different zoonotic pathogens. Here's some examples of what we found. We found that they were able to carry MRSA, or methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, antibiotic-resistant E. coli, species of Salmonella, Clostridium difficile, and even hepatitis E virus. So to give you a bit of a disease ecology lesson about how we think about rats and their pathogen risks, they act as a sort of pathogen sponge in that they're able to soak up and carry whatever pathogens are present in their environment. And for the most part, these pathogens have no detectable negative effect on the rats themselves. And this is important because it means that rats in a neighborhood like the downtown east side of Vancouver that has some significant socioeconomic and sanitation issues are likely to have an entirely different pathogen profile than rats from another neighborhood like Kitsilano in Vancouver that might not have those same issues. But beyond the risk of zoonotic diseases, why else do you think urban rats are an important issue in our cities? Yeah, so it looks like most people have answered there. Yeah, and most people got that question right. You know, it's a little bit intuitive that rats are associated with many different issues in the urban environment. So they're able to not only spread zoonotic diseases, but their presence in your home and other buildings can increase the level of indoor allergens through dander from their fur, their urine, and their feces. And this has been associated with increased asthma morbidity. Their presence can adversely affect mental health, especially when they're in people's homes. You know, you can imagine rats scratching at the ceiling above your bed while you're trying to sleep, or threatening the safety of your children in another room. They can cause significant property and infrastructure damages. Here's a picture of a rat that died chewing on the wires in my car while I was doing that work in the downtown east side. But they're also able to cause structural fires by chewing on wires, and they can actually collapse sidewalks and streets by burrowing underneath them. Their presence can decrease utilization of public spaces. Here's a picture of a wonderful wedding garden that I saw in one of the cities I visited for this work, and you can see those massive rat holes in the background, really making this an inviting place to take your wedding photos. And their presence can damage business reputations, especially restaurants, and they can contaminate and consume foodstuffs. And urban rats are really an ancient problem in that for as long as people, we have lived in cities, we've been trying to control rats in those places. So to give you a bit of an idea about how long we've been trying to manage urban rat problems, the main species of urban rats today, the brown rat, began to spread globally with humans through the 800s into the 1800s on ships and other forms of transportation, giving them their global distribution that they have today. And there's even some archaeological evidence of a rat-proof granary or food storage facility from 13 BC in Rome. And here you can see a very gleeful rat catcher crawling out of the sewer with his rifle after rat hunting in the early 1900s in Europe. So urban rat management is nothing new. It's ongoing today. But despite the fact that we've been doing it for so long, rats do appear to be thriving around the world. And we can see that they're thriving through three different pieces of evidence. So first of all, anecdotally, anyone who's ever lived in a major metropolitan area or a big city can probably anecdotally attest to the fact that rats were a problem there. We see periodic news reports from journalists and other news agencies reporting on infested cities and overrun neighborhoods. And then we can see reports like this from large pest control companies like Orkin reporting on which cities they got the most rat calls in every year. And so here you can see Orkin reporting that Chicago was the rattiest city in the United States for 6 years in a row, despite the fact that Chicago does have an ongoing rat management program. So that leads us into, I believe, the last poll question that I have in this presentation is, what cities have successfully controlled pre-existing rat problems? Okay, so it looks like most people answered either Edmonton or Edmonton and Budapest, probably colored by the earlier question where I said that Alberta doesn't have major urban rat problems. And the actual answer is it's unclear. But I would say that Edmonton and Budapest have come the closest, and we can talk about that when we talk about Alberta at the end of this presentation, and we can talk about Budapest as we want, if we want to as well. And the reason that it's unclear is because when you start looking into this question of what cities have successfully controlled their existing rat problem, you actually find that there's a really limited understanding of why, how, or even if management is failing to deal with these urban rat problems. We don't know whether rats thriving in cities is actually a consequence of management failures. So we don't know what those management goals are and whether they achieve those goals. So this uncertainty is what led to our research question in this work. And just quickly, our research question was, what are the characteristics, strengths, weaknesses, barriers, and opportunities associated with the theory and practice of municipal rat management? And can we take that information and pull out some tangible recommendations for municipalities in the design and improvement of their own municipal rat management strategies? So to answer this research question, we used what's called data triangulation. And data triangulation is simply looking at this research question from the perspective of different data sources to get a more complete and thorough understanding of the research question. So in this research, we looked at 4 different data sources. Those included the municipal rat management literature, the opinions and perceptions of municipal rat management stakeholders, and an in-depth review of several municipal rat management programs and associated municipal regulations regarding rats. So I've organized the rest of this presentation around the analytical steps of data triangulation, and I've color-coded the slides accordingly so that if you ever get lost, you can look at the color in the bottom of the slide to figure out where we are in this overall triangulation. So the first step, just quickly, was to qualitatively analyze data from each of those data sources. Step 2 was to compare key themes across those data sources. Step 3 was then to explore and describe any ideas that emerged from doing that comparison across data sources. And then finally, but very importantly, to try and draw conclusions and make those recommendations relevant to our research question. So without further ado, I'll move on to talk about step 1, which was to qualitatively analyze data from each source. So the first data source, which was the perceptions and opinions of municipal rat management stakeholders, is currently published in the Journal of Urban Ecology, and it's titled Stakeholder Perspectives on the Development and Implementation of Approaches to Municipal Rat Management. So for this project, what I did is I spoke with and held in-depth interviews with a series of rat management stakeholders from different cities across the United States of America. to talk to them what they thought worked in municipal rat management, what the goals were, what wasn't working, etc. And a key finding from this work is that these stakeholders, on large, really felt that municipal rat management is an essential service that municipalities should be providing to their citizens for all of those reasons that I mentioned earlier, why rats are problematic. But then interestingly, most of these stakeholders felt that rats in cities were a highly complicated problem for which nobody had an ultimate solution to. So in the second and third data sources were published together in the Journal of Urban Affairs. And this study was titled Municipal Urban Rat Management Policies and Programming in 7 Cities in the United States of America. So for this work, what I did is I actually traveled around to these 7 different cities which had established municipal rat management programs in place. I held focus groups and interviews with different members of those municipal rat management programs, and they took me out in the field to show me what their programs were doing and what worked on the ground and what didn't work. And I combined a review of those programs with a review of the municipal policies or regulations in place regarding rat management in each of those cities. And so a couple key findings from this work is that these rat management programs and policies are ultimately designed to reduce rats across as large a scale as their resources allowed. And then the program served as a sort of brain for the overall municipal approach, directing and adapting the city's strategy towards dealing with rats. And the regulations served as a sort of scaffold or baseline structure for action, something the programs could fall back on to do things in the field regarding rat management. And then finally, we published our literature review in Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, and this is titled Reconsidering the War on Rats, What We Know from Over a Century of Research into Municipal Rat Management. So in this study, which I actually did first, but we pushed to the end of the study so that we could look at the literature with a fresh lens after doing the original work, we looked at literature as far back in time as we could find regarding municipal rat management, and we were able to go back to the early 1900s. And what we found is that in more than a century, there really has been little to no change in the approach to municipal rat management. And this was really so profound that I could take one of the earliest studies that we found in this literature review, from 1909. I could change and tweak a few examples to make them more contemporary, and I could probably publish that study today. And many municipal rat management experts would say, yeah, that's what cities should be doing, and that's what they're not doing. And then despite the fact that there's been so little change over this extended period of time, it was really interesting to find that there was few to no examples of cities actually meeting their own pre-specified rat reduction objectives, even though that's what they were aiming for, and even though they haven't changed over time. So that brings us to step 2, which was to begin comparing key themes across those different data sources that I just spoke about. So one of the most important themes that arose here is that there is this entrenched war on rats paradigm driving the municipal rat management approach in cities, the approach in research, and the opinions of the stakeholders that I spoke with. So what is this war on rats paradigm? Well, it's simply a view of what rat management is and what it should be. And the war on rats is this view of municipal rat management as the need to reduce rats at as large a scale as possible and for as long as possible. And the methods that were associated with achieving this approach is what's called IPM, or integrated pest management. And integrated pest management approaches are the best practice rat management techniques at the property level. And so that involves first using all of the lethal control measures that you have at your disposal, but combining that with finding the food, water, and harborage sources of those rat populations and trying to remove them so they can't come back after you've done some extermination. And the main innovation for taking these to the city level we found within this war on rats paradigm was simply to apply these techniques across as many properties as possible for as long as possible. And here you can see stakeholder 3, who is a private pest management professional, really capturing the essence of this war on rats, saying, the goal of municipal rat management should just be eradication. But we found that there was limited evidence supporting the effectiveness of this war. And most importantly, we found a lack of quantitative evidence. So for example, in over 100 years of literature, we found no clear examples of cities or researchers successfully meeting their own pre-specified rat reduction objectives within this war on rats paradigm. And here you can see Meyer from one of his seminal papers on municipal rat management in 1999, capturing some of the disappointment that has been so persistent in the literature, saying, perhaps one of the most disappointing aspects of rodent control over the last 30 years is the failure of governments to address such a collective problem in a collective way. And you can see people in the literature saying the exact same thing right through till today. And interestingly, although we've stuck with this war on rats approach for so long, there really was a low prioritization of this war within cities. And because it was a low priority problem for both municipalities and the residents in those municipalities, it received perpetually low levels of resource investment. So here you can see stakeholder 4 who worked in the city operations department of one of the cities I visited saying, rat management is not going to be the highest priority for us. Making sure that roads are paved and making sure that people have the infrastructure they need to live their day-to-day life is always going to be a higher priority for streets, sanitation, trash collection, things like this. So what this captures is that in cities, municipal governments and residents really have other more important problems that they're concerned about. And this idea of reducing rats really just falls low on the priority list. And then finally, we found that this war really only addresses one component of a much more complex system. So let me walk you through what I mean by this. So the focus of this war is on rat reduction. It's directly and myopically on the rats, like you can see here. And so what these war on rats approaches really do in practice is they go to properties that have rats, they exterminate as many rats as they can, and then with what resources they have left over, they try and reduce those food, water, and harborage causes of those rat populations. And what we found happens almost inevitably is that this approach is inhibited by barriers outside of that rat level focus. So they go in, they kill the rats, they try and reduce the garbage problems, but then they find that there are all these residents in the neighborhood that keep contributing to those garbage problems. And because this war on rats approach was designed to reduce rat populations directly, they don't have the expertise or the resources to do these more complex things like dealing with resident behaviors and trying to change those behaviors over time. And as you start zooming out, you can see that there are more and more barriers outside of that rat level focus that really inhibit this rat reduction approach. And if you keep zooming out, you might eventually get to a place like this where you can see that rats are just one symptom of a big, complex, messy urban ecosystem. And when you start looking at the rat problem in this way, you start to think that the war is likely something that cannot be won. And when you compare this to the original view of this focus directly on the rats, you can start to see why the war isn't something that we can win. So, for example, if you want to deal with a rat problem in an area that has a lot of deterioration, neglect, and disorder, you also have to solve the problem of urban deterioration, neglect, and disorder. And clearly that's not an ultimately solvable problem. And so you can kill as many rats as you want and clean up as much garbage as you want. But if the neighborhood is still deteriorated and neglected by the residents in the city, those rat problems are just going to keep coming back perpetually over time. And so the war is just something that we have to keep fighting and keep putting resources towards. So that brings us to step 3, which was to explore and describe emergent ideas and themes that we started to see arise from comparing across these different data sources. So one of the most important themes that arose from doing this work is that municipal rat problems appear to be aligned with a group of problems called wicked problems. So what are wicked problems? They're a class of problems that were first labeled as such and outlined by two urban planners, Riddle and Weber, in 1973. And in their paper on wicked problems, what they did is they defined two broad classes of problems. The first class of problems they called tame problems, and they reserved tame problems for those class of problems that were immediately definable and had a yes or no, right or wrong answer. So for example, a tame problem to them was a math problem in a textbook. The other class of problems is what they called wicked problems, and they reserved these for those class of societal problems in which it was really difficult to pinpoint what the problem was because there were so many different stakeholders interacting with this problem, and they all had different views depending on where they interacted with that problem. And so that ultimately there was no solution to these problems that could meet everybody's needs. And so in their paper on wicked problems, Riddle and Weber outlined 10 criteria, 10 defining criteria for these problems that they felt are what made them intractable or unsolvable. So what I did in this work is I compared municipal rat management to the wicked problem criteria to see if municipal rat management is indeed a wicked problem. And so here's one of the key criteria for being a wicked problem. Solutions are not right or wrong, but they're good or bad. And here are 3 examples of a good, bad, and very bad approach to municipal rat management. So starting on the left, we have good approaches to municipal rat management. This is a rodent-proof garbage container. And this is a good approach because not only does it reduce one of the main food sources available to rats, but it reduces other negative wildlife-human interactions that might result from open garbage, things like coyotes, raccoons, skunks, crows, etc. And it might make the neighborhood overall a more inviting place to live rather than just dealing with this one small problem, the rat problem. And then we have bad approaches, and that includes the widespread use of rodenticide perpetually across cities. And this is problematic for a number of important reasons, chief among which include the fact that when rodents eat this poison, they can then die or be consumed by another animal like a bird of prey and an owl, and those animals can then die. And then we have potentially very bad approaches to municipal rat management. This is a paper that I published in my master's back in 2018 showing that traditional kill trapping methods, or what I've called culling here, can actually result in a paradoxical increase in the prevalence of certain pathogens among the surviving rats. And we theorize that this happened because this kill trapping disrupted the normal social patterns within these rat populations, changing the transmission dynamics of this bacteria, Leptospira interrogans. And so I go on to show that, yes, municipal rat management does appear to be a wicked problem because it meets each one of these 10 criteria, or at least it can be shown to meet these 10 criteria. But rather than go through each one of these criteria in excruciating detail, I just want to highlight 2 really important themes that arise from reconceptualizing municipal rat problems as a wicked problem. So first of all, this lens highlights how municipal rat problems do not have a single definition. There's no singular definition of a municipal rat problem. And because of that, there's no ultimate solution that can address the problem as it exists for all stakeholders. So let me give you a concrete example of what I mean by this. Consider these 2 different neighborhoods or these 2 different contexts in which people interact with rats. So these are 2 neighborhoods that I visited during my city visits. And on the left, we have this deteriorating, neglected, and disordered neighborhood in one city. And then in another city, we have this historical, clean tourist destination neighborhood. And because rats are so adaptable, and for lack of a better word, they're just awesome, both of these neighborhoods had severe rat problems. Now, if you live in the deteriorating and neglected neighborhood on the left, it's likely that you view rats as just one symptom of the overall neglect and disorder of your neighborhood. And if you live here, you might find it crazy for the city to be spending a large amount of resources on just trying to kill rats before you deal with these underlying problems of neglect and deterioration. In contrast, if you live in the other neighborhood, rats might actually threaten the historical integrity of the buildings and the old sidewalks by burrowing underneath them and causing those fires that we talked about earlier. And so if you live in that neighborhood, reducing rats to as low a level as possible for as long as possible might be a really important thing to you in this neighborhood. And to demonstrate this a little bit further, I'll show some unpublished data here that we are currently finishing up writing our manuscript now. So these are rat complaints made to the city of Vancouver over several years. And what we found through looking at the text of these calls, why people called the city to complain, is that most people were not primarily concerned about rats. In fact, about 70% of people listed rats as a secondary concern, while only about 30% of people were primarily contacting the city about rat problems. So instead, what they cared about is these larger issues on the right associated with rat problems. So for example, if you look at the first or the third column here, garbage, these calls involve people calling the city to say, hey, 311 operator, my neighbor is super gross. They don't clean up their lawn and it is garbage and it's smelly and there's crows in the area. And oh yeah, it also attracts rats. So can you come make my neighbor clean this stuff up? So that's wonderful. What have I said so far? Rats are this super complex problem integrated with perceptions of the problem and this big, complex, ever-changing urban ecosystem. But what now? What can we actually say to municipalities who want something concrete that they can do about their rat problems? And so we tried in this next section to come up with some tangible recommendations for what cities can do to operate within the context of this problem being wicked. So first of all, let me walk you through how shifting the view of this problem from the war on rats lens to the wicked lens can change how individuals and cities view and approach this problem. So first of all, on the left, within the war on rats approach, this view conceptualizes the problem as a singular problem. The presence of rats is the problem, therefore we need to kill those rats. The wicked problem approach acknowledges that there are all these different problem definitions. Because of this view of the problem, the war on rats approach approaches this issue as a solvable thing. Let's eradicate the rats. And the wicked problem approach acknowledges that there is no ultimate solution because of these shifting problem definitions. The war on rats approach acknowledges that this is a complex problem, but it primarily conceptualizes that complexity as the need to identify and solve each food, water, and harborage cause across the urban environment, which of course we saw earlier was not something that's really possible to do. The wicked problem approach conceptualizes this complexity in a more nuanced way and views it as a big, complex, open system, so a system that's connected to other systems. And because of this view of complexity, the war on rats approach does not account for those varying perspectives of the problem, while the wicked problem approach specifically tries to account for those shifting perspectives and priorities. And because of this, and this is really key here, because the war on rats approach doesn't account for those shifting perspectives and priorities around the problem, it really becomes a low priority issue because, as we saw before, most people are not primarily concerned about rats, and so they're given these perpetually low levels of resource investment. The wicked problem approach tries to address this part of the problem by specifically trying to account for stakeholder priorities. So how can we account for stakeholder priorities? Well, one of the first things that we need to do, and one of the first things that's highlighted when you start thinking about rats as part of a bigger system, is the need to refocus away from just the rats onto those interfaces which connect people to rats. So there's environments promoting negative rat-human contact. So what do I mean by that? What does refocusing on interfaces look like? So let me give you one example here. This is one small part of the overall municipal rat problem, sewer rats. So the war on rats approach has primarily viewed sewer rats as a problem simply because they are present there. And because of this, the approach to dealing with sewer rats has pretty much only been to hang rodenticide on the bottom of sewer covers and call it done, and just keep doing that over time. And like I talked about earlier, this is really problematic. And it's especially problematic in sewers because a lot of that poison that doesn't get consumed or that does get consumed and disintegrates with the rat body will eventually get washed away into wastewater in nearby water bodies where it's been shown to be able to accumulate in fish and other aquatic species. So how would the interface approach be different for this one aspect of the problem? So the interface approach would first say, okay, well, that's great, sewer rats. Well, is there an interface between sewer rats and people? And because we have focused so strongly on the war on rats approach, in most places, there's actually very limited research on this part of the issue. We don't know whether sewer rats actually cause important interfaces for people. So we might do this research and find that, oh, actually, you know what? Sewer rats spend most of their life in the sewer. And if we find that to be the case, maybe their presence will be considered acceptable. If we start thinking about them that way, we might find some benefits associated with their presence. So for example, I saw a recent study which showed that without rats in certain sewer types, they were more likely to back up and clog because there were no rats to excavate the soil and things that accumulated in there. Now, if you talk to a lot of rat management experts, they will highlight the fact that sewer rats do cause an important interface for people. And that's because sewer rats are able to burrow outside of sewers and excavate the soil around them and cause the collapse of not only a sewer, but sometimes the street and sidewalk above. So the interface approach here would say, okay, that's an interface. Well, how is it occurring? Where is it occurring? And how can we modify it so that it doesn't occur in the future? So for example, if we start looking into this and trying to understand where rats can burrow outside of sewers, it's likely that we'll find that rats are only able to do that in certain sewers. So old brick and wood sewers where they're able to burrow out and excavate that soil. And we might find that they're not able to do that in pipes made out of reinforced concrete or that are regularly maintained. And so part of the solution there would be changing policies around construction and management of the sewer system. And this is a work that the Vancouver Rat Project has actually started doing as a spin-off from this work. So here is a study published by one of my colleagues, Maggie, and it's called The Characteristics of the Urban Sewer System on Rat Presence in Seattle. And what she found is what I was talking about earlier, and that rats were more likely to be found in sewers made out of certain materials and that were maintained for a certain amount of time. So we want to address these interfaces rather than just the rats themselves, but we have to remember that we're addressing these interfaces in the context of a wicked problem. And a common criticism of the wicked problem approach is that this leaves the manager with what's figuratively called wicked bad paralysis, or to throw your hands up in the air and say, well, what the hell is the point? If we can't solve it, if we can't make any progress, why should we bother spending resources on it? And you can see how a manager might find themselves with that wicked bad paralysis when you start thinking about all of these upstream determinants of the rat problem. You know, it's potentially very overwhelming. And then on top of that, each of those interfaces may be its own wicked problem with no solution. So for example, I've listed poverty here. It's clearly not a problem that we can just solve, and it's comprised of its own complex and ever-changing system. So what I did next is I wanted to give a really easy set of instructions, step-by-step instructions that a city could use to start reconceptualizing how to operate within this wicked problem view of municipal rat management. So I'll walk us through this really simple diagram here. Starting on the left, we have that overwhelming number of interfaces that I was talking about. And the first thing that a city has to do to act within this big complex system is they have to choose which interfaces they're actually going to try and take action upon. You know, no city in the world has all the resources to try and solve all of those upstream determinants. And there are several key pieces of information that cities can use to try and prioritize those interfaces. And I've highlighted two potential ways to do that here. So one is stakeholder priorities, and that's perhaps the most important. So trying to understand why municipal residents care about rats and what their priorities are. So looking at the complaints data like I showed earlier to see what people care about with regards to rats. And then you can combine that with what I've called here maximizing the systemic benefit. So when you think about rats as a part of a system, you can use software and other modeling approaches to try and conceptualize what benefits and consequences will occur across the entirety of the system because of your intervention actions. And what you might want to do is try and maximize the benefits across the system. So for example, if you choose your interface to be unsafe and unsecure rental properties and residential areas where people are dealing with rat problems and their landlords aren't taking action, if that's your interface, acting upon that interface and trying to give people a more safe and secure living environment and better relationship with their landlord is going to have many benefits beyond just reducing those rat-human interfaces. You know, people will get a better night's sleep, they'll be able to perform better at work, they won't be worried about their child's safety, they'll get them to school on time, etc., etc. And then finally, once we've chosen the interfaces we're going to act upon, we have to remember that each one of those interfaces might be its own really complex problem. And the way to move forward within those complex problems is to use what I've called here incrementally muddling through. And this sounds like a piece of jargon, but to use an American metaphor here, it's simply using a silver buckshot approach as opposed to a silver bullet approach. So the silver bullet approach we're all familiar with. This is coming up with a single ultimate solution that will solve the whole problem. That's what the war on rats approach has been trying to do. What is the ultimate solution to eradicating rats? The silver buckshot approach is different in that it's making many small changes across all of the different upstream determinants of your interface without fully understanding what impacts they'll have, but continually monitoring those impacts over time and continuing to change them as you learn what's not working and what's working. And together, all of these small changes can have a relatively large impact on the interface. And what you want to do is just acknowledge that you're never going to solve this problem and continue to chip away at it over time. And this is really important here because it allows you to adapt to changing stakeholder priorities around the problem over time. So I'll just wrap things up now with a quick summary. So what have I said in this very long and complex presentation? So urban rats are clearly a problem that need to be managed, and they need to be managed because of all the reasons we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. Their disease risk, they cause fires, they cause property damage, etc., etc. And clearly the current approach is not working, and it's not working because it's not meeting its own goals, and it's not creating stakeholder satisfaction. And one of the primary reasons that the current approach appears to not be working is that it's too myopic, it's too focused on rats, while in reality the system is this big, complex, ever-changing system. And so cities really need to first recognize that municipal rat problems are these unsolvable problems because they're part of these big, complex systems. And only then, by not trying to solve the problem, can they actually start to make some progress forward. So I'll just thank the whole research team and open it up to the question period.